So I'm going to cover a couple things in this talk. We're going to talk about what happened before the quake, mostly a summary. The impact of the quake on local railroading. Going to discuss just in general the Boulder Creek branch, the Boulder Creek, Wildwood, and Northern Railroad, and the golden age of railroading. And you may think, wait, isn't the golden age when all the lumber companies were happening? Well, there's kind of two golden ages. So this will be the second golden age. Then, of course, you have to end with the line at the end of the line because we don't have a railroad here. So you all get the fortunate part of the story where I talk about the sad end of the railroad. But there's a little bit of hope because the Santa Cruz Lumber Company kept things going for a bit longer. And we'll end with that. So, to get things started, back in 1883, the South Pacific Coast Railroad already had a route over the mountains. It cut through Felton, went through Big Trees, which is Henry Cowell. That track's still there. You can ride it from Roaring Camp. It's the big Santa Cruz Big Trees and Pacific Railroad. 1883, South Pacific Coast decided to found a subsidiary called the Felton and Pescadero Railroad, and that would go up here. Its technical purpose was to replace a lumber flume that came from about 2 miles north of here all the way down the valley to Felton. And it did replace it eventually. It took a couple years. But so the purpose of this railroad was as a narrow gauge track up the San Lorenzo Valley for the very express purpose of getting lumber. Now, South Pacific Coast was wealthy. They wanted to make sure that people could actually use it for a passenger line. So it certainly had plenty of passenger cars, and it had a regular scheduled route that went the entire time with or for passengers, but it was always primarily a freight line. And that's where this talk will get very interesting later on. The original route was completed in 1885, and through a couple mergers, it was consolidated in 1887, so Felton and Pescadero Railroad only lasted for actually 4 years on paper, 2 years in actuality, and then it ceased to exist in 1887 because it got consolidated into this new company, the South Pacific Coast Railway, which is just the same name basically. But then just a month later, it got leased to the Southern Pacific. And Southern Pacific was a huge corporation, often called the Octopus. Many of you probably have heard of it before because it only went out of business in 1996, and it serviced virtually everything in this part of the state. And so when the Southern Pacific took it over, it renamed it the Felton branch. Not the Boulder Creek branch, the Felton branch. So there's going to be lots of photos with this, which will probably make a lot of you really happy. Some of these were in the last talk. Some of them were not. And I tried to mix up a few also, so they're the same things, but different photos of the same things. So this picture here is taken from Felton, behind the Felton Presbyterian Church, which is the current Felton Library. And you can actually see somebody wrote SP on there. And that is the train going down the Felton branch, the later Boulder Creek branch, through more or less where Mount Herman Road is right now in downtown Felton. And that would be from, that one we actually have a date. I didn't have that in the last talk, so it's May 9th, 1908. So, I don't have pictures for everything, so unfortunately some of the stuff jumps a bit, but there was a mill at Newell Creek. And Newell Creek, today is this, if you go up there, it's where we have the dump, but it also is where Loch Lomond is. But a mile and a half up there, which is now the face of Loch Lomond's dam, that mill was there. That mill was built around, actually I have the date for it. It was built in 1905, and it was the weirdest thing ever because that was actually a full official branch line of the Southern Pacific Railroad from 1905 to 1913. It was called the Newell Creek Branch, and its entire purpose was to get trains from the Newell Junction stop, which was on Glen Arbor, basically where the road up Newell Creek goes today. And then it goes up to a mill, and then past the mill, there's another at least 2 miles, possibly even more, that went up right through the Loch Lomond there today, and they'd take big lumber, or big logs like this to the mill. And they had one major mill, so these came down there and were milled on the site. Now moving down a bit more, and we're going to have more pictures of the routes between, but I just wanted to give some highlights. This right here is Boulder Creek in 1893. And I found out just today that that water tower actually disappeared. I have no clue what happened to it, but it got smaller and moved down to near the end of the switch, so kind of like right at the front of this picture here. So you will only see that a couple pictures, otherwise it's smaller. But you can see the freight house, or the engine house over there, that could hold 2 switch engines. They were small, all narrow gauge little engines, and that's what it looks like up close. And yeah, the switch engines, they needed 2 here. That's how busy the freight yard in Boulder Creek was. And the freight, just to give you an example of how big it was, everything behind the firehouse in Boulder Creek to the river was the freight yard. And so it was an extensive area. I mean, this picture here, you can still kind of see where the imprint of the old flume used to be because there's a gap between tracks. But this is a very integrated yard at this time. All the tracks are narrow gauge. All the tracks that ended up going north of Boulder Creek are narrow gauge. So that's all integrated, all connected together here. And it's a large yard. You can see all the stacks of lumber on the left there. And this was the major shipping point. At one point in Boulder Creek, or in Santa Cruz County's history, this was the 5th largest lumber shipper in the state. And so this is a huge place. There weren't a ton of people living there. Yeah.
How far up the hill from Boulder Creek did these lumber operations take place? Did they go all the way up to?
We'll get to that. Yeah.
236 or? Yeah.
We'll get to it. It's not quite that far, but yeah, we'll get to that in a minute. In fact, we will get to it pretty shortly. So yeah, and this is just a picture of the depot. This is technically the second depot, which was located more or less behind the fire station today. And that's just a narrow gauge South Pacific Coast Railroad train. They kept using the South Pacific Coast as a subsidiary of the Southern Pacific. They kept using the narrow gauge trains all the way until the line was standard gauge, which would be 1908. All right, so the earthquake. Now, this is where things start getting interesting. Everything before now I've already talked about in another talk, and hopefully that will be online in a bit, sometime in December. But so the earthquake really changed everything. April 18th, 1906, San Francisco got demolished. Fires for the next couple weeks burned everything that survived. All the records for Southern Pacific basically got burned unless they had copies of them, which for a lot of things they didn't. Especially for a couple things I'll talk about in just a minute. The Summit Tunnel, which was a tunnel that was over a mile long between the town of Wright and the town of Laurel, way up in the mountains. It's basically near Highway 17 near the summit. That collapsed because the San Andreas Fault went right through it. It shifted by 6 feet and it had numerous cave-ins. So the entire route over the mountains was shut down. It was shut down for 3 years. There's also numerous other things, just to give you an example. This is a track near Wright. You can see this was from a sink that literally, from the earthquake, literally yanked a chunk of the track right out of its alignment. And you can also see it's triple track there, which is very important to remember for a few minutes from now. There's also a massive landslide below Inspiration Point along Highway 9. And that was actually repaired relatively quickly because until that was repaired, everything in this valley was trapped in this valley. There's 2 routes out of the county, and both of them were locked because of the landslide and the tunnel collapse. Just to make things a little more annoying, this isn't railroad related, but Saratoga Toll Road was also shut down because of slides. And so the north end of the valley was basically blocked off. So you really just couldn't get out of this area for that first few months after the earthquake. But the fortunate thing for the Boulder Creek branch is it survived. It had very little damage, and it was operating more or less at full efficiency, minus the lack of getting out of the area. It was operating at full efficiency almost immediately. And also, the most important thing of all, everybody needed building materials. San Francisco had burned to the ground. All those lovely Victorian homes, well, the old ones were gone, and now we needed new ones. And so that was really beneficial for the mountains. But here's a little fun fact. Until the 1906 earthquake happened, people thought that the redwood resources in these mountains were infinite. And they already knew that wasn't true because most of the San Lorenzo Valley was already completely harvested. But there still was Pescadero, which was just over the hill. There's Butano. There's Newell Creek, which is still being harvested. There's a number of tracts that were up in the hills north of here that were not yet harvested or were in the process of being harvested. So there's still a lot of potential, and they still thought there's at least 20 more years, maybe more, before everything would be harvested. And this isn't the redwood trees you see today. These are the old growth trees that you see when you go up to Big Basin, you go up to go down to Henry Cal. These are old, really strong and sturdy trees, and they're just clear cutting them. And so San Francisco is burned down, and that's going to be their chief source of renewal, really. And so just these pictures are not from the mountains, but I wanted to show you some examples of just some earthquake damage. So there's the track alignment there. This is the Wrights Tunnel, or the Summit Tunnel. And this is just an example of the yard that was in front of it. This is the repair yard. You can see all these stacks of timber next to it, and all that's going into the tunnel because they have to replace it all. And they also decided, just because they already had to do it anyway, that they're going to standard gauge the whole line. And so a lot of this is to help standard gauge it too. So there's ties, there's rafters, there's all sorts of things. I have probably 30 pictures of just this construction work. This is just an example of it, but it was a very busy scene there. They actually had to lift up and move the station to a different place just so they could have more space. This is the track at Moss Landing for the Pajaro Valley Consolidated Railroad. You can see that the track bent a bit. And so obviously we're having some problems here. And then last, this is Chittenden. You guys probably have gone on the road through here a number of times on your way to Gilroy. Chittenden, they happen to have a fruit boxcar train sitting on the tracks right there when the earthquake hit. Well, all that fruit's now on the side of the road. So you get a nice pile up on the side here. So South Pacific, or Southern Pacific, they wanted to do the most with their opportunities, and they'd already been doing a number of things. Even before the railroad was acquired by Southern Pacific, South Pacific Coast intended their entire line to be standard gauge someday. They were playing it kind of cheap at the beginning. It's like, we're going to do this as an experimental thing, so we're going to use narrow gauge tracks, but we're going to make everything that we can standard gauged. And that was great because starting in 1897, they started standard gauging the entire line from Alameda, near Oakland, all the way south to Los Gatos, and did it really quickly and efficiently. Now, the problem is the mountains were not quite so easy to replace. And so the first thing that they ended up doing was, there was a big, actually I can show you the picture of that. So that tunnel there, it's concrete, and it's actually kind of old. This is 1907. That concrete tunnel had already been there for 13 years. What happened was that tunnel, the original tunnel, was built in a gully. And anybody who knows about gullies knows that water goes down them. That kept washing out every single winter. And they finally got sick of it when it really just wiped the entire tunnel out at one point. And so in 1893, they built a new tunnel, and they made the very smart decision, we're going to make this a standard gauge tunnel. And so that's the first tunnel portal. The other end of it was not replaced at the time, but that's the first tunnel portal that they actually did. And if you look, I can't actually use my mouse there. If you look to the right of it, there's actually a spillway that they installed, so that gully water can go elsewhere from now on. And that continued to be used all the way until that line closed in 1940. And the spillway survives. The tunnel doesn't, but the spillway survives as well as the little culvert. So, but that was that was more of an opening shot. They still hadn't actually started the upgrading yet. So in 1897, they made a general policy that whenever a tie needs to be replaced, we're going to start using standard gauge ties. This is across the entire network. So that includes the Boulder Creek area. And then the first thing, actually I'll give a couple other waypoints first. In 1895, the standard gauge tracks made it to Los Gatos. In 1900, full passenger service and freight service started to Los Gatos using those tracks. So there was a number of years before they actually started using them as a standard thing. But so in 1903, that's when this area, this route, finally started really getting its upgrade because they replaced the bridge at Clear Creek. Clear Creek is the creek that goes through the middle of Brookdale Lodge. And so the tracks are really, really close to San Lorenzo River there. They're just right up on the bluff. And so it actually was I wouldn't say significant, but it's a decent quality bridge that was needed there to cross that creek. I've seen it. I mean, half of it's still there. The bridge itself's gone, but one of the abutments is still there. And so in 1903, they replaced it. And that was the first standard gauge bridge built on the line. And then from 1905 to 1907, everything else was standard gauged. Just methodically standard gauged. And you have to remember, these bridges that we're talking about, we're talking wood bridges, are now being replaced with steel girder bridges. These are strong ones that can support really heavy trains and that aren't going to need a lot of maintenance in the future. I'll show you a couple pictures of them. Yeah.
So the piecemealing standard gauge in the
Yeah.
But they must be still maintaining the narrow gauge.
They are, yeah. Yeah, definitely. They're still retaining, or they're still keeping the narrow gauge stuff. That what they ended up doing is once they finally started getting the standard gauge in, they did something called triple rail, which is where I mentioned, remember that thing. So triple rail is standard gauge tracks with a narrow gauge track in the middle. And so, see, the narrow gauge can go on the left there, and the standard gauge takes up the whole thing. And so what happens is once they finally get enough track in standard gauge, they'll keep both until they can abandon the narrow gauge. And so, did I have it there? Yeah, so in October 1909 is when they finally tossed out that third rail, that middle rail. And so 1907 is when they first started standard gauge service, but they still had so much freight coming in from over the hill from north of Boulder Creek that it took them a couple years to really commit to getting rid of that third rail. Yeah.
Were they able to convert the rolling stock to standard gauge?
No.
Abandoned them?
No, all the rolling stock in the valley. That's actually a very good point. All the rolling stock in the valley, the cars, the flat cars, most of it was hauled out right before the earthquake, which ended up being a big oops because then they couldn't get back. And so then the track that was north of Boulder Creek, that's an independent logging company line, that route pretty much dominated for about a year and a half the entire network because they're the only ones that had narrow gauge stock left. And then they finally were able to bring in some more. That I'm certain they brought some in from via ferry because the railroad wharf in Santa Cruz, they could bring stuff in with that. And then also once they got the track from Watsonville working again, they could carry it in. And the Watsonville track, good thing to point out, the track between Watsonville and Santa Cruz, that had been standard gauged in 1883. Just standard gauge. There was no third rail or anything. So anything coming from Watsonville that was narrow gauge had to be hauled via flat car. So flat car stuff came up here constantly when machinery had to get fixed, when it had to get repaired. But it could go down to Santa Cruz until 1906 because that was all triple tracked until the third rail was thrown out. All right, so May 1909, the route between Los Gatos and Santa Cruz reopened as a full standard gauge line. So now everything in the system is standard gauge except for the stuff north of here. And we'll get to that in just a few minutes. But remember that the stuff north of here is still narrow gauge, and it will always be narrow gauge, where everything else in the network is now standard gauge. Oh, and just for a fun little extra thing, it finally became the Boulder Creek branch in 1912. I don't know why they decided to change its name then, but they did. So here are some fun pictures, and Lisa will be interested to know that I finally identified where this was. This is Felton. This is actually the little bit of grade going next to Graham Hill Road near Felton. And they are actually, I have multiple pictures of it. This track right here is right next to Highway 9, or Graham Hill Road. When you're heading towards Roaring Camp and you are going over Zione Creek, this is to your right. It's the little forested area between Zione Creek and the lumber yard and Roaring Camp and stuff. Yeah.
So I don't know where you got these photos from, but we have that family album in the collection.
Yeah, you gave me the photos.
Oh,
Yeah, it was the Aram family photos. And Aram was the station agent in Boulder Creek, so it's sometimes hard to identify stuff. I found some of his stuff at the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History too, because he just took photos of railroads wherever he went. So, but yeah, you can actually see the Felton Yard just in the distance over there. And so there are probably, because the age for this photo seems to be about 1907, so they're probably doing repairs on the track, preparing it for standard gauge, or doing a full upgrade process. Yeah.
Right where the Felton Bible Church is, as you go across the creek there, is a concrete abutment from the old bridge they used to go across there.
And that's that one was actually built in 1917. That's one of the last ones that has a date. That would be just to the right of this. And yeah, that is very interesting because I have a picture of that I didn't put here, but it had a concrete abutment on one side, but it just had this trestle work on the other side. And so sometimes these things, they didn't need it. I think it has a pier in the creek, but sometimes you don't actually need the concrete on both sides. And the same situation happened to other crossings over the San Lorenzo River in the valley. And so, moving on. This is a fun picture. It's not very good quality, unfortunately, but it is snow. This is roughly across the Yeah, this is basically where the laundromat is in Felton. And so where that building is, that's pretty much where the laundromat is. And this branch that you see to, I suppose it's your right, that's the branch that used to go to Old Felton, where they had the Holmes lime kiln. I'll show you another picture of that in a minute. And then the Boulder Creek branch is to the left over there. And so somebody thought that it was a very scenic day with this light snowfall, so they got a nice picture of it. And a number of people have asked about this. This is the bridge that you can still see the abutments for right next to a covered bridge. The covered bridge is to the left. This bridge was it was a nice steel truss bridge, but the crossing was just a little too big, and everything that was crossing over that was filled with lime. Lime is very heavy. So almost immediately when they started using that bridge, it started to go, ooh, and they realized we need to put a pier in the middle of the creek. The pier is completely gone. There's no sign of it. I have no clue where it went, but they did end up having to put a pier in there. And this, for reference, and here's another picture. This is of the Holmes kiln. So this is what was at the end of that line. Yeah?
So when did they construct that bridge?
I believe it was 1909, or 1908, 1909.
Was it simply to connect the old Felton branch to the new Felton
Yes.
branch?
And so I don't want to get people too confused, but the original route of the railroad that went to Felton actually followed the west bank of the river, and it went through pretty much all the little communities are next to Highway 9 and ended about where the Orthodox Church New Leaf is. And the problem was that was all narrow gauge, and it really didn't have much of a purpose. It was a kind of long line for not a lot of... The only thing that was using that was the lime kilns that were up, and this is on Heen Street now. And so because it wasn't that profitable, what they ended up doing is they abandoned 2/3 of the old Felton branch. They upgraded the rest of it, the bare minimum that they needed to upgrade to maintain it, and then they built that over the creek, or over the river. And so all of a sudden, Old Felton, which used to be its own branch line, and used to originally be the terminus of the really old Santa Cruz and Felton Railroad, suddenly became a stop, or a spur stop, along the Boulder Creek branch. So it's a kind of a weird situation. You'll see in a number of books, even mine to a degree, that it looks like a big loop track, kind of like an upside down teardrop or something. You have to remember, those tracks on the opposite sides of the creeks never coexisted at the same time, except for possibly a few months in 1908, 1909, when this was being built. There never was a full balloon track where people would go around that. It only ever came up on the west bank or over from the Boulder Creek side, or Boulder Creek branch. So, but that was added during the standard gauging because they got rid of the narrow gauge, so they built this. And yeah, this is a slightly earlier picture. I don't have any pictures of it during standard gauge times, but you can see there's a train sitting down there waiting to pick up some, looks like it's actually dropping off some lumber, or some split stuff and firewood.
That would have been a narrow gauge train right there?
That was a narrow gauge, yeah. And they're dropping off firewood, it looks like, for the kilns, and the kilns are over to the left. So these are two really cool pictures that Lisa from the SLV Museum found. This is the most impressive bridge on the entire Boulder Creek branch, and honestly, it's probably the most impressive bridge in the entire county. This is the original bridge here. You can see there are 3 spans of this Howe truss bridge, and it required 7 piers to support this thing. Each one of those had a pier at the end as well as one in the middle, and it still had trestle work on either side of it. Now, what I've realized, though, is it's a little deceptive. You see those concrete piers there? I don't think they're actually supporting anything because they're really low, and this is what replaced it. So around 1908, this bridge replaced the earlier one, and this one's clearly using the concrete piers. It's resting right on top of it, but this one's kind of hovering on top. I think they actually built those piers before they replaced the bridge, and then this thing's a prefabricated bridge. They'd bring it in chunks and just assemble it on the site in one afternoon. And so I think that's what that's showing. But you can see all that line of piers there, which is just really cool. And the coolest thing of all is this still exists. All the piers, not the bridge itself, but all the piers still exist near California Drive, just north of Ben Lomond. So, was there a question over there?
That was what I was going to ask.
Oh, yeah.
It's still there.
Yeah, and almost all of the concrete piers you're seeing on this line, they still exist. All the abutments, they still exist. Some of them are on private property, so I'm not going to say go check them out, but they do still exist, every one of them, and except for that random one next to a covered bridge. No idea what happened to that pier. But
So if we had enough money, we could reinstall the railroad down through the
we can talk about that after during the question period. So there are not very many pictures of the other narrow gauge bridges, but this is one of the standard gauge ones. This was near Siesta. People love taking photos of this. I found at least 4 different ones, although this one's the most famous one. This one's been colorized at least 3 different times, slightly different. One of them was in the fall, which is kind of fun. And then you'll find it on all sorts of marketing and stuff. And Siesta, yeah, I'll talk about Siesta in a little bit. But Siesta is one of the stops of the, let's just say it was a rich person stop. We'll put it that way. Does anybody know of Fred Swanton?
Yeah.
Who doesn't know Fred Swanton? Nobody wants to admit now. Fred Swanton is the guy who founded the boardwalk. In 1904, he made the Neptune's Casino, took over the Miller Librant Plunge, and then in 1906 it all burned down, and the next year he built up what's currently there today. So the casino and the mini golf building are the original buildings built in 1907. So Siesta is just to the right of this photo, and he bought a property here, just a summer cottage, and there's another stop that we'll talk about in a bit that's also one of these summer cottages. But he bought a summer cottage here, and he had a lot of friends with the railroad, and so he, of course, got them to have a stop right at his place. And if what we think is true, it's possible that the little station that they built there is still today hiding up in a tree as a treehouse. So it may still survive. And that's kind of one of the fun legacies of this route, because most of the stations and stops that had physical buildings there, they disappeared, but most of them didn't get demolished. They just went places or got repurposed. So we'll get back to that later.
But where is Siesta now?
So Siesta is just south of Brookdale on the other side of the river, off of Larkspur.
So you can see it from the light.
You could what?
You can see it from the Brookdale light. Just look.
Yes, actually, yeah, you're right. If you where the washout is right now, if you look to the right, you should be able to see the piers down there if you have the perfect angle / got out of your car, which I wouldn't recommend. But yeah, I believe I've actually seen one of these piers before. And then this is Brookdale back in its heyday. It's not a very busy day, and I intentionally chose a bad picture for this because you get a better one later. But you will notice one thing that I talked about earlier is the tracks there. These are narrow gauge tracks, but you'll notice a lot of the ties are really wide. That's because this is after 1897. They were already working on upgrading the tracks. And so they've started that policy. We still replace all our ties, so you got some of them here. There's a spur there, but there's also a second spur hiding in the bushes here. That's the original Reed spur, which is what this stop was made for. This stop was a lumber mill originally, and they had a spur that went up to a little mill, or a little loading area off Reed Street, off Reed Street, which is still there, sort of. And that's what that spur is. The spur didn't go away until it got standard gauged. And so it wasn't being used by this point. That stop actually it got discontinued in about 1895. So, but Brookdale, this is during its early years. All right, and then we're down to Boulder Creek, and we've got the same kind of thing. We've got weird shaped ties. This is just in the year, or a couple years before it got standard gauge. You can see some people just chilling. You can also see kind of the decay in the ties. They're all kind of wobbly and stuff. They're clearly ready to be replaced. And yeah. Okay, so before we talk any more about the Boulder Creek branch, I know a lot of you guys are really wondering, well, I keep talking about what's north of here. And I even started with showing you that there's a route north of here. And it stayed narrow gauge. So this is called Dinky because the engine that they had running on it was nicknamed the Dinky. It was a very small locomotive, and it was one of the original 2 that the Santa Cruz and Felton Railroad used. And I put this here because something really interesting happened with the earthquake. Is they didn't have enough lumber north of Boulder Creek to help build Santa Cruz, rebuild San Francisco. So they just started doing the best they could with what they had. So we had the California Timber Company was incorporated in 1903 with its major headquarters in Waterman Creek, which is over on the other side of Saratoga, or on Waterman Gap. So you go up to where Highway 9 is, and with its junction with 236, and Waterman Gap's on the other side of that, or Waterman Creek's on the other side of that. And so that was the main mill, and they were sending tons of stuff, and they owned the railroad that went north of here. And then also the F.A. Heen Company was built right after the earthquake because their main mill at Laurel was landlocked at the time. One of the tunnels was done. Basically, they just kept having one tunnel closed and the other one closed while they're repairing and upgrading them. So they needed a reliable mill, so they opened one up on Kings Creek. There's a spider hanging here. And so those were the only two mills, though, because almost everything else that used the railroad north of here, they got consolidated into the California Timber Company. Almost everything in 1903 got consolidated. The only exceptions were stuff that was up Boulder Creek or Bear Creek, and they didn't need to use the extension railroad because they could ship it straight to town. And so in 1906, there wasn't a whole lot going on except these two mills, but they were still using the line for a number more years. And just for reference, the California Timber Company, they finally closed in 1913, so they operated for a while, and Heen finally relocated back to Laurel in 1910. And so we also have this weird little history with the name. So you'll see pictures that show the Boulder Creek and Pescadero Railroad. That never was an official name. But in 1903, the dinky, the engine, got really badly damaged because it fell off the side of the hill and lost pretty much everything at the top of the locomotive. So it needed to get repaired. They sent it to Alameda, and for some reason or another, when it came back, it suddenly said BC&P Railroad on it. It was not the formal name, but the newspapers had been using that name off and on for years, and so it seems to have kind of been the accepted nickname, and it's kind of evokes this interesting idea of, wait, Pescadero, right, we're going to Pescadero. There was always this like ephemeral dream of we're going to Pescadero from Boulder Creek. Because you're really not that far. You're technically, through railroad alignments that could have been possible, we're as close as 20 miles from Pescadero from here. It doesn't feel like it. Oh, not from here, from about 2 miles north of here. Yeah.
Do we know what the planned route was to get there?
Yeah, that's actually what I was going to say. So the planned route is, I hinted at this earlier. 1906, everything burned down in San Francisco. One of the really unfortunate things for everybody here who wants a railroad that goes to Pescadero is apparently the plans that they had drafted over the last 3 years were in San Francisco. And because it was still an early survey, they had actually done 3 surveys. The Southern Pacific had done 3 surveys, and their chart seems to have been there because nobody's ever found it. And there's one newspaper record that suggests that it was actually burned there. Now, granted, newspapers are not 100% reliable at this time, but I kind of want to believe them on this point since the Southern Pacific building got burned down. So there was another railroad, though, called the Ocean Shore Railroad, which was operating at this time, trying desperately to get enough money and interest to go north. And that one also wanted to build a route to Boulder Creek. And Southern Pacific and them kept fighting for years over who would build this route. And then neither of them built the route. So just to summarize the potential of this line, there were proposals to get it to go to Redwood City, to get it to Congress Springs, which is just outside of Saratoga, to get it to Los Gatos, to get to Vasona Junction, which is basically Los Gatos. It's 2 miles from Los Gatos. And there's one other one. Oh, to Mayfield, which is Palo Alto. Yeah.
So do you think that the establishment of the state park had an effect on
Yes.
the railroad being built?
Yeah, so there's 2 reasons why they wanted to build this railroad to begin with. Is in 1902, California Redwoods Park, big basin, opened, and tourist potential was astronomical. And in 1902 there was no road, at least no official road. It was still a couple years before they built what became 236. And so everybody wanted to go there. And so almost all these proposals included a ridgetop electric trolley line. And it would come from wherever this crossing was and would go up the hill a little bit to Big Basin. Again, never happened, but almost every proposal you'll see mentions this electric trolley line as an aspect of their idea. And then the other thing, and this tells you that lumber is always the primary concern. The closest that ever got was when the Coastline Incorporated, half of its funding came from the California Timber Company. And so, or at least it was pledged. I believe it didn't happen because of the earthquake, but when it was incorporated, the California Timber Company wanted half of that, and it's because they wanted Pescadero Creek's timber. And they had a lot. They had 8 miles of timber up there, and they never actually harvested all of it. And that will come back a little bit later in this talk. So there was a lot of potential, and it kind of just fell apart. And so 1914, the year after the California Timber Company shut down, the entire line was leased to a property firm. They wanted to sell subdivisions. And their number one subdivision, which they founded in 1909, was called Wildwood. And it's 2 miles north of here. It still has one sign that vaguely references Wildwood in the area. I think one of the roads is called it. And they were catering to Oakland families, because at this time, the wealthiest people on the Central Coast lived in Oakland. So all these wealthy people from Oakland were like, we want to live or have a summer house in the mountains. And this isn't today where we all go to the beach and everything. This was, you spend weeks, the whole summer maybe, in the mountains, and you just enjoy life. Yeah, you may go to a beach a couple times, but you just enjoy life up in the mountains. And so they've really succeeded. And so they were probably doing this as early as 1910, but from 1914 officially, they were shuttling people up here via the railroad. And it would go right past here for 2 miles. It never went past Wildwood at this point, because there's nothing past it. The tracks were still there, but the tracks were not graded for passengers. They never graded past what became Wildwood for passenger usage. And there was no lumber concerns or anything after 1913. So let me show you some. Oh, and the line was scrapped in 1917, which, if you know your dates, World War I, that's when we entered the war. All of a sudden, we wanted a lot more metal. Hey, well, there's a bunch of metal for 8 miles up this valley. We scrapped it and sold it to steel scrappers for use in ships and whatnot during World War II or World War I. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so ignore the Kings Creek mill, the track next to Kings Creek, but remember that was proposed at least 3 different times. And Heen apparently, F.A. Heen, Frederick Heen, huge magnate in Santa Cruz, he apparently delayed building his King Creek mill 1 year because he was expecting that line to be built, and it never got built. And so he finally just said, well, I need it because the earthquake happened. But that's why he didn't build immediately in 1906. They waited until 1907, is because he was really hoping he could convince people to standard gauge this whole route. All of this was narrow gauge. It went all the way up to basically where the San Lorenzo River logo or label, thank you, is up there. And these are just the stops that existed during after the earthquake. And so I've left off everything else here before the earthquake. So we have Wildwood here, 2 miles north of Boulder Creek. Doherty's Mill site, the mill was abandoned, but it seems that parts of it at least survived for years. That was eventually turned into Riverside Grove, which is a subdivision there, and there is a sign for that. Waterman Switch is up there. A little bit lower about at that crossing is McGaffigan Switch, which became San Lorenzo Park. And so, yeah, which is, I forget what that's in San Lorenzo Park. It's a small subdivision. And Waterman Switch ended up being important for various reasons that we'll get to in just a little bit. Actually, we'll get to right now. So the last operation that used the Doherty line for lumber purposes was the California Timber Company on Waterman Creek. And what they'd do is they'd harvest all the lumber and they'd send it down the hill. And they probably used a combination of skid roads, because trucks weren't here. And they probably just pretty much slid the lumber straight down the hill or carried it with wagons down the road that's still there today. From the top of the hill, it's like it zigzags a little bit to get down from Saratoga Gap or Waterman Gap. That was probably originally a wagon road, but there also is evidence that there was a kind of straight shot down from the top, and so they probably brought lumber down via both ways. And so once it was at Waterman Switch, which is up there, from Waterman Switch it was loaded on the trains. And that kept going until 1913. So this is after Wildwood developed. They still had some lumber coming down the line. But then that closed down, and nothing, the California Timber Company, actually, I think the company closed down after this. It reincorporated as a different company, but it left the area. Just to give you a perspective here, this is probably, it's a Kings Creek mill. We're assuming it's the Heen mill because it's the one that's most talked about and the dates are right, but we're not 100% sure. Yeah.
So is the Waterman Switch about where Highway 9 crosses the river?
Yes, actually, yeah, that's a good reference point. Yeah, if you keep going way up north, just within the Castle Rock State Park boundaries, you'll see the sign saying Castle Rock State Park. I mean, you're still in the valley at this point. And then you'll suddenly turn left. I mean, all of Highway 9 turns left and then starts climbing up the hill. Where it starts climbing up the hill, that's Waterman Switch. There's a little kiosk there. You can go to that kiosk. It's supposed to be a parking lot, but the gate's always locked, so I don't know how you actually get there.
The property has cameras all over it right now.
Well, there you go.
They're very high in security.
Well, there you go.
So,
but there is a kiosk there, and that kiosk is basically the Waterman Switch. That is Waterman Switch, and the right-of-way is actually still visible just on the other side of it. It's very overgrown, and a lot of it's sunk because the ballast and other things have made it sink. And also, it's still got the ties, and so the ties are all rotting, and that also makes it sink. But yeah, a lot of the right-of-way still exists in parts. So this is probably the Kings Creek Mill, and you can see the tramway track. The track itself isn't actually, or tramway platforms. The track itself isn't actually put in yet, but it would be. But no railroad actually went up here. It was proposed numerous times. It just never happened. And then moving on to some fun postcards. This is Wildwood. This is one of the postcards. It said it's the rich Oakland elite. They're the ones that want to come up here. So this is one of the many postcards he had. They have people next to what looks like a piano or an organ of some sort. And they got some people in the river. And then you have the Dinky. So you can see Boulder Creek or BC and P Railroad. And so this is after it was changed, and now it's the Boulder Creek and Pescadero Railroad. And then this is just some action shots. That's it coming down or up the Doherty line to Wildwood. This is the last bridge it crossed before it made it to Wildwood, and you actually can see just the roof of a building over on the other side, and that would be Wildwood just on the other side of that little creek. Sorry, it's a bad quality picture. I was trying to change them up, but this one just didn't do that.
Do you know if anybody's ever really done any serious research to see if any of these engines, like the Dinky or some of these other ones, ended up in a scrapyard someplace in South America or Mexico, who knows where?
We'll get back to that during the questions at the end. For the Dinky, I don't know what happened to the Dinky. I think it was just scrapped. But by this point, by the time it would have been scrapped, it would have been 40 years old. So it was definitely aging, and it's a narrow gauge train in an area. Most of California by this point had no narrow gauge tracks at all. So
it might be in somebody's garage around here.
That would be funny to know. If somebody's hiding this in their garage, let me know. So this is the actual camp at Wildwood, and you can see the bridge over the river just in the background there. And you can see the little tents. These are very similar to the tents that would have been like down at the boardwalk a decade earlier. They're just the little vacation tents. And then at one point, they finally gave up on the Dinky. It was too expensive to maintain, and so they bought this. It's a motor car, very similar to the rail cars that they still have today. This is actually a rail bus, they called it. But you can see, mostly because it's holding 15 people at least on there. That thing's really crowded. But you can even see in the background to the left there, a little sign, a wooden sign over the pathway that says Wildwood. All right, and that's just a shot from the front of it. And then this is kind of the was it swan song of the Doherty line. Bruce McGregor and Rick Hammond both in their books with this photo, or in their sections on this with this photo, and just some women walking down towards a trestle, but it kind of just gives you this, invokes this feeling of like, well, this is the end of this line. You can just see how overgrown it is, but that bridge still survives at this time. There's no trace of it left anymore, but just a fun little picture.
Is that a third rail from the narrow gauge time?
No, in the middle of that would just be a derail in the middle of the track. Almost all the bridges here had derails because you don't want them to fall into the river. So going back to the main branch, the Boulder Creek branch, its golden years were very much a sunset years, and it really did just start declining slowly from this real big height. And I mentioned that all the lumber companies were pretty much done by 1913, but it survived for another 30 years, another 20 years, and it was tourism. That's the only thing that made it financially viable, and tourism has never been a very viable thing for railroad lines. So it's kind of this wonderful era of railroading in the valley where you're not getting a lot of freight traffic on it, but they're not really making money, so it's not 100% clear why they're even bothering. And they did do one fun thing to try to avoid it, which will come up later. But let me show you some pictures of kind of the golden era of this. So after 1913, it became a tourist line. There were a number of stops. You'll recognize some of these. Glen Arbor, Ben Lomond. I already talked about Siesta. Brookdale, Camp Joy, Filbert. And also all the station structures, all of the infrastructure was pretty much upgraded during this time. 1910s, almost everything got replaced, including the stations and everything. So clearly the railroad still saw some potential. They're still investing in this line, even though their number one source of revenue is the lumber, and that's gone. And so this just gives you an idea of how crazy. I don't know why there's a dot next to Brookdale on the other side. In fact, all these dots are slightly off for some reason. But you can see all those are actual stops on the line. Those are registered Southern Pacific stops. I believe there are a total of 13 of them that lasted on the line in the last 20 years. And, I mean, that's crazy. It's 13. You can just see the cluster of them between Phillipshurst and Harris. There's just a huge cluster of them. Yeah?
So how many of these were actual stations and how many of them were flag stops?
It's a good question. The actual stations, I can actually say right now, technically Old Felton had a station, although that was abandoned pretty early. Felton had a station, Glen Arbor had a station, Ben Lomond, Brookdale, and Boulder Creek. All the rest of them had at least a shelter. And so we have photos of at least 3 of those shelters. Phillipshurst is probably the only one that didn't have a shelter of any sort. And we have pictures of that don't show any shelter. So unless it's from an angle that doesn't show it.
You know, one thing that might be a nice addition on there is to show the route that goes over to the San Jose.
Yeah, well, that would actually be over here. It would be a little, well, I guess it would cut off a little bit. But yeah, it curves away this direction.
The Diane mill up there, it actually had a narrow gauge track that went up the side of the hill and to a loading spot next to the main standard gauge track where they could move the wood from there over onto the standard gauge.
Yeah.
San Jose.
That's very true. Although by this point in time, even that operation was unfortunately closed. That one closed around 1900. But yeah, you're right. And so these are just some spots along the line. This was Rose Acres. This is pretty much where Daybreak Camp is, just outside of Felton. It was the Bonnie Bray stop, and this is just a home that's there. And then this is actually just right down the tracks, probably close to where the little apple farm is now on, I guess it's off of San Lorenzo Way, also just south of Felton, or north of Felton. And so that's Rideout Ranch. Then this is Glen Arbor. And Glen Arbor, it's a very busy day. You can see there's an excursion train of some sort there. Now, Glen Arbor was a property subdivision, just like a number of the other ones. They wanted to get people here to move into the area. And unlike Wildwood, this one was extremely successful. And so a lot of people moved there, and Glen Arbor even today is a huge subdivision.
Looks like commuters to me.
Where on Glen Arbor was that?
So if you go over Glen Arbor Bridge now, before you take the really sharp turn to the left, it was pretty much just a block down from that. So I forget what the road is called. Fremont. Yeah, thank you. And so, yeah, and the right-of-way actually became one of the roads there. So there's one road that loops where all the others are kind of straight, and there's one that loops. The looped one is the right-of-way. Although following the right-of-way in that area is surprisingly difficult. It doesn't quite follow paths that you'd think. But yeah, so this was a housing subdivision. This is a nice colorized postcard of Ben Lomond. This is their earlier station, but the tracks are standard gauge at this point, so you get some nice, and you can tell because it's got a Southern Pacific boxcar over there. Southern Pacific didn't really have much rolling stock, so if you see a Southern Pacific on this line, it should be a standard gauge one, but they haven't replaced the station yet.
What road is that through Ben Lomond? What?
That is located directly behind the Shell station. So, and I believe north would be on the left, so where this boxcar is, just a teeny bit over from there would be where Highway 9 is today.
This right behind the Shell station?
Yep, and that, not that depot, but the newer depot got repurposed for a house. So it still exists. I didn't know that until about 3 weeks ago. So but I was every once in a while I do Google Map searches, and I suddenly realized that the house behind it was quite old. And then literally the next day, somebody volunteered the information that, oh yeah, I own that house. So
is it in the same location?
It hasn't moved. It's in the same exact spot right behind the Shell station. You cannot see it from the road, though. You have to actually Well, you may be able to if you really keep between
that
fences.
building?
Well, not the second building. This one got replaced.
There is one that followed that one, and that's right behind the Shell station.
Yeah, still today. So just north of Ben Lomond, this is the first bridge over the San Lorenzo River, not counting the one in Felton because that was a later addition. This was one of the original bridges over the San Lorenzo River. And this is the first one on the way to Boulder Creek. So it stayed on the east bank of the San Lorenzo River the entire way from what was called New Felton, where Roaring Camp basically, all the way until this point in Ben Lomond, just north of the Tyrolean Inn. That was all on the east bank of the river. So this is the first place where it crossed over to the west bank.
Going north?
Going north, yeah.
In the south, they go over Love Creek first.
Yes, they do go over Love Creek. That's true. This is a fun picture because these are two different pictures clearly taken at the same time, where I think the men switched out to take pictures. George Pepper and Ronnie Trubeck lent me these photos about the same time, and I thought they were identical until I put them next to each other and realized they're clearly not. But so this is the only picture we have of the actual Phillipshurst stop. There's a picture out there of the bridge, and Phillipshurst itself is the Blake Hammond Manor that if you go north from Ben Lomond, where there's the first big turn on the road, that's where the Blake Hammond Manor is, and it has a whole history. I'm not going to go into the history, but it has a whole history of its own. But its original owner was a doctor. For the sake of right now, I'll just call him Dr. Phillips. He had first names, but it was Dr. Phillips, and he had a lot of money, and so he built a really big mansion there, and he owned everything on the other side of the road, which is River Road, I think it's called River Road. He eventually sold that and became a very wealthy, very small subdivision, and this was on the other side of the river, so you had to go across a little pedestrian bridge to get to this. And so I don't know who these people are, but the women are the same. The man is different. And on the picture to the right, you can see somebody walking on the tracks back there. The number one way that people walked between Felton and Boulder Creek was the railroad tracks. It was dangerous, but it was much safer than trying to walk the roads, especially after the car was invented. So it was probably a lot cleaner, too, because tracks drain water a lot better than muddy roads do. Back to Siesta. I already talked about Siesta a bit, so I'll just show the picture. But this is a Trainman's Barbecue. That was from 1912. There's also a couple pictures of this in circulation. You can see the railroad tracks right there. This is looking to the east, so they are probably, the station itself would probably be behind them. For a while, I thought this may be a picture of the station, but I think those are actually some of the early summer cottages that were built in the Siesta subdivision. And this is fun. There's a fish hatchery. The building still exists, although it's just a really big private residence. But there's a fish hatchery just south of Brookdale that operated for a number of years. It was built in 1903, right next to something called Steen's Spur, and it lasted until 1953. Yeah, and California Fish and Game Commission took it over in 1912. It was originally just made by Judge Harvey Logan, who also founded Brookdale, and after 5 years, after 7 years, he kind of clearly either got sick of it or the Fish and Games Commission decided they wanted to take control of it. But that had its own stop. You can see the railroad tracks right in the foreground there. That had its own stop. I don't know if it was used for anything other than passenger services. It could have been used for a very mild freight.
Sorry, what year was that? I can't see.
This picture is about 1920. I estimated a bit with this, but earlier pictures don't show as much vegetation in the back, so I was guessing about 1920. And so here's a busy picture of Brookdale, and you can see it. Lots of people out there, and also you notice the cars there. Omen of doom for railroads. So you see the cars there, but this is still a very busy day. In fact, here's a picture of some ladies driving a car right next to it. Yep.
So I just want to point out that sign, the Brookdale sign that's above the station, is actually on display at the San Lorenzo Valley.
That's true.
It
Although a little cut down.
It has, unfortunately, its ends cut off because it didn't fit across some of the fireplace. But we do have that.
Yeah, and actually I believe that's the only sign on the Boulder Creek branch that I know exists. A number of other signs in the county exist in random places, but I think that's the only Boulder Creek branch one. And so yeah, there's some lovely ladies in a car. You can see the details of the station here. This is this is pretty much the only non-standard station that we have really good details with. Most of the stations were just kind of rectangular ones. They'd be split in half with the passenger stuff on one side and kind of just like a baggage room with maybe some small freight in the other side. But this one was a seasonal station. It was only open during the summers. In fact, tracking it in timetables is a pain because if you have a timetable that's not from a year or from the off season, this doesn't always appear on it.
Oh, that's a woman driving the car, too.
I know. And you can see there's still an actual booth in there. So it's got a nice covered eave, but there's actually a little booth in there. So it would have a station agent in the summer seasons.
Can I make a quick point? I don't know how many people know of the Swanton Pacific Railroad, but that was the engines that were from the 1915 exposition up in San Francisco. And a fellow named Lewis McDermott spent many years building these 1/3 steam engines that were used at the exposition. And unfortunately, he went broke because everybody wanted to ride on a car like that instead of riding on an old steam train. So.
Well, it makes sense. The advent of the Model T Ford was one of the worst things that ever came to the railroad. But there was a good 15 years where they overlapped without too much competition. But yeah, once they started getting more affordable, it really things started going downhill. And then this is just a fun picture. This is, you can barely see it, but this is the second Boulder Creek Depot with the freight shed in the back and just some guys hanging out next to some tracks. And finally, I get an actual full-size picture. Here's the actual Boulder Creek Depot. This is the upgraded depot, though. You can see it's a bigger building, very standard design. You got those 2 sets of windows and really tall ceiling, and it's about twice as big as the old depot. And again, it's a pretty busy day, and again, there's a car there. So you got to watch out for those cars. They're just ready to stab the train in the back. So this is just one last picture. This is the freight yard. In some of its later years, this is still when the Doherty line north of Boulder Creek's operating. But you can just see, like, the town has grown quite a bit since the 1880s in this. And the yard is still really massive, but it's no longer integrated. The narrow gauge tracks don't connect to the standard gauge tracks after 1909. They actually have to, any cargo you have to unload and then reload onto the much bigger standard gauge trains, which made for a lot of inefficiency, but there really wasn't any other option other than standard gauging north of here, which they just never did.
So where's Joe's bar?
I can show you what, Lisa can probably point that out. I can show you that what is it?
Yeah, it's out there.
Yeah, that's the iOS building.
Where was the station?
The station is right here.
Yes.
It's right behind the firehouse today, or well, right where the firehouse would be today, behind it.
Was this taken from across the river on?
Yeah, this would have been taken. This would have been taken above. Was it Junction Park? Like up. I forget what road that's called now.
My guess is that this photograph was probably taken from around about Middleton Way. Not Middleton as you come down, Middleton Way, just off of Bear Creek, looking down. It's probably Middleton that actually commissioned this photograph.
Well, and you can see something really interesting with this is probably in the 1910s, and the hills have trees again. If you look at pictures from 20 years earlier, the hills are very sparse. They still have some trees, but they're very sparse. But these are all very young trees. You can still see quite a bit. So they're growing. Downtown's got some bigger trees. You got some big trees in the foreground. Pine trees and fir trees weren't always as useful to the companies because they wanted to get redwood trees. So those sometimes survive. But yeah, all the redwood trees in the hills are very young still. Probably only in their 20s or 30s at this point. Maybe a little bit older because Boulder Creek itself was harvested pretty early. But yeah, it's still pretty young. So the end of the line. I already mentioned the Model T, ruiner of all great things. So most lumber concerns had left. Passenger revenue was never very high. It was good in the summers. It still probably wasn't actually paying the fees, but railroads have often operated at losses in areas while they've worked at profit in other places. But then the worst thing ever happened. It was the Great Depression, 1929. Everything went bad, and tourism died. Nobody had money to do it. And the Boulder Creek branch was the first area in the county that really just got smacked with the Great Depression. 1931, passenger service just done. There's no money for it. Nobody's riding it in the summer or winter now. Passenger service is gone. What became Greyhound bus replaced it. Southern Pacific either owned or worked with Greyhound at this time. It's not quite clear. But Southern Pacific and Greyhound operated the bus service from 1931. 2 years later, the railroad's like, okay, we're still not making any money. There's no tourism on here, and we're not getting much from lumber. I mean, there's a couple very small lumber concerns, but nothing of note. So they filed for abandonment in 1933, and January 26th the next year, it was finally abandoned. And so, just to show, these are kind of the end times. Now, this one still is a little bit earlier. This is the photo I have says 1910. I suspect this is actually late 1910s. But this is a McKean auto car, or motor car, sorry. And they tried really hard to cut some corners. Let's replace passenger service with one of these. These things could not handle the curves and the grades in the valley at all. And so it only operated for maybe a couple years off and on, and it just never worked. And so they discontinued it. So that's it next to Ben Lomond, and that is the second Ben Lomond station. So this is the one that would be behind the Shell station today. And so, again, taller, wider, looks identical to the Boulder Creek station. And you can also see there's probably ballast cars next to it. So they're still working on upgrading the line at this time. And I don't know where this is actually taken at, but it's supposed to be somewhere along the line. And then this is just a fun little picture. These are some people hanging out on the old turntable that was in Boulder Creek. This was near the far end of the yard, so that way. Or, I don't know what direction. Yeah, that way. Far end of the yard. The turntable, they're just chilling out. This is probably taken in the teens or in the 20s or early 30s. The station shed or engine shed at this point wasn't being used. It was just sitting there. And then this is the photo that I used on the poster. This is the last day of the railroad. They are taking all the remaining rolling stock. They left a lot of lumber, but they're taking all the remaining rolling stock. From this point on, any lumber concerns up in the mountains would be by truck. And I'm just going to because I'm a little over, I'm going to very quickly end this with what will probably be really unknown to a lot of you. This wasn't the last local railroad. This was the last connected one.
I thought I read that there was a commemorative special of the Suntan Special that ran in the early 50s, just once.
Suntan Special never went up to the mountains, though. Suntan Special, the commemorative one ran along the coast. And so, yeah, they've had a number of them, but all the Suntan Specials after 1940 ran along the coast between Santa Cruz and Watsonville. Before then, it would run over the mountains, but not through Boulder Creek. It would run through Los Gatos. Yeah.
Through Los Gatos.
Yeah, but that line got pulled up in 1940, so after that, it couldn't do it anymore. So one thing most of you don't know is that there was actually one more railroad. It wasn't technically in Boulder Creek, but it used Boulder Creek, and it was from the San Lorenzo Valley. That's George Lay, who basically owned the huge chunk of the middle of Felton. He had a mill, and in 1923, the Santa Cruz Lumber Company established their mill up on Waterman and Pescadero Creeks, roughly in the same area that the California Timber Company operated 10 years earlier, but just they harvested downstream California Timber harvested upstream, Santa Cruz Lumber harvested downstream. They had a large mill. It could do 60,000 board feet of lumber a day. Board foot is 1 foot by 1 inch thick. Lengths vary, but it could do 60,000 board feet a day. It decreased its numbers. It started with about 85 people. It decreased steadily as the decades went on. But they brought in a Shea locomotive, which is very... You can see a Shea at Roaring Camp. They have 2 of them there. And the Shea locomotive, in 1930, they hauled it over the ridge. There's no railroad tracks in Boulder Creek anymore. So that's the mill itself. This is the map. So let's see. This would be Highway 236 and Highway 9. And so teeny bit of it. The mill was basically on the edge of Santa Cruz County. But you have to remember, everything they produced came through Boulder Creek. Boulder Creek was still their avenue. If the railroad had existed, like they hadn't pulled it up, they probably would have shipped out through the Boulder Creek, or the line north of Boulder Creek. So the locomotive, they had no other way to get it there. So they had to highline it, which pretty much means they used a combination of poles and steam donkeys and wires in some way that I cannot possibly fathom in my head. And they lifted this thing to the top of the ridge, then they lifted it down into the valley. They had to do it in a couple pieces, so that's the bigger part of it, but yeah, those are the same part. But there were some other heavy bits that they brought later, like the trucks. But so that's how they got it there. So they had to take it up from Waterman Switch, although the track was gone, but they took a truck up to Waterman Switch took it over the hill, and then down on the other side. And so, I mean, it was probably about 1.5 miles, 2 miles that had to haul that thing in as the crow flies. And so as they built the line, they built 8 miles of track, no branch lines, a couple spurs, but nothing else. 8 miles and almost a direct line down Pescadero Creek. And this is just them building it. This gives you an idea of some of the trestles that we dealt with. These would have been similar to trestles north of here, maybe not as deep, but the quality is the same. That is one giant log. There are people standing on top of it. So there gives you some scale. If you thought that was small, those are people on it. That was a standard gauge, I believe, track, and it was just on top of probably 2 logs. There's probably a second one on the other side. 2 logs, and they just stuck it on top. This is the same stuff that they had going up in where Forest Nicene Marks is, and you can see a little bit of a remains of one of these up there. But these things were crazy, and these are the same kind of things that we would have had up on the border, or north of Boulder Creek. North of Wildwood, they were really financially or fiscally responsible, depending how you think about it. They did haul full logs rather than lumber. They hauled full logs to the mill and then used trucks to get it out of there. Although initially they had no road, so they actually had to use high lines, those same things that got the train there. That's also how they hauled stuff out of there to Waterman Switch, where they then had the trucks. And so you got some fun trains here. It was always numbered number 2 for tradition's sake. Actually, there was no number 1 engine. And then this is kind of them at their log pond. And they actually had a giant log mounted at the end of this railroad. And the train would just crash into it. And the flat cars would go under the log, but the logs wouldn't. So the logs would fall into the pond.
They also changed the grade of the track, too.
Oh, they changed the grade. Yeah, you're right. It's tips. You're right. And you can actually see. Yeah, you're right. So you can see it here. There's a big log in the way, and so it's going to knock them off into that. I mean, it had a full engine house. It had a full maintenance facility. They even had a little passenger car. This was another rail bus that was made. It was made out of a flat car that they just kind of mechanized. So just to wrap everything up, there were some last vestiges. The Holmes Kiln Spur, which was that old Felton spur that went next to Covered Bridge, that actually survived till 1938. So that was the last trace of the Boulder Creek branch. The rest of the branch line was gone, but that actually survived 2 years until the end of the actual mountain route. So that was still there, which meant all the track from Felton, the Roaring Camp today, across next to Mount Herman Road, or Graham Hill Road, would have still been there until 1938. Fish hatchery operated until 1953. Ben Lomond and Brookdale depots both were turned into houses near or on their original sites. Almost all the bridge piers at Buttman survive. Almost all the right-of-way between Felton and Glen Arbor is still intact. Most of it's owned by the Santa Cruz County Water District, and so I'm not going to say you can go check it out, but it's there. And there are little bits elsewhere, and the bridge abutments are often the big key. In fact, just south of Boulder Creek, there is a bridge abutment that still pops out at the San Lorenzo River that you can see from Highway 9 if the trees are cut properly, which they sometimes are. And yeah, almost everything else on the line got turned into housing subdivisions. So there's nothing else left, unfortunately. Yes?
Is there available anywhere, has anybody made a map of the old rail lines overlaid on a map of present day where you can see real...
Yes, on my website. Actually, I will end with that. If you go to my website, I do have a map. It's a modern Google map, or Google Maps that's been completely customized. Just click on map at the top, and you can check out the whole thing. It compares, and you can do the different layers. It compares the entire historic route. I mean, it's not 100% accurate just because the lines can't always curve properly. But it superimposes it all with all the spurs and everything. So, thank you guys. That is everything.